I don't know about you, but this week I heard some stories from the people who live in Charlottesville, and I was haunted by some of those stories. And here are some that I wanted to share with you. Charlottesville resident Mary Esselman was heading home after going to her synagogue that morning with her son, and she wrote, "My 13-year-old son and I stood by ourselves on the corner down the street from the synagogue, in front of the Catholic Church, trying to walk back home, but interrupted by a stream of white extremist marchers with their signs and firearms and crazy regalia. I felt like an idiot, but tried to look each in the eye and say, 'Peace, and peace be with you,' with as much sincerity as I had in me, trying to reach some humanity in them. And they jeered, and they mocked me, and called me what you might imagine. Told my son Luke that his mom said this and that, and was this and that. Our path home was blocked by them, and we had no choice but to face them, just us alone on that street corner, and all of them menacing, streaming past us on their way to the rally. Later, when we were a block away from where everyone was clashing, and when we were considering going to the front steps of the public library, there was a big line of white supremacists, the leader wearing some kind of yellow spiked helmet. And as they tromped toward the rally, these lovely older women standing beside them, wearing sky blue t-shirts that said Quaker. And they kind of trotted alongside those white supremacists, holding signs that said love. I was armed with my iPhone and my dog leash. My son Luke was armed with his acne and his hormones. University of Virginia student Isabella Ciambatti shared her experience. I was on Market Street around 11:30 a.m. when a counter-protester ripped a newspaper stand off the sidewalk and threw it at the alt-right protesters. I saw another man from the white supremacist crowd being chased and beaten. People were hitting him with their signs. A much older man, also with the alt-right group, got pushed to the ground in the commotion. Someone raised a stick over his head and beat the man with it, and that's when I screamed, and I ran over with several other strangers to help him to his feet. And there's Reverend Seth Wispelwee, a pastor in Charlottesville, and he shared his experience by writing, "The white supremacists did not blink at violently plowing right through the clergy, all of us dressed in our full clerical garb. White supremacy is violence. My strong stance is that the weapon is and was white supremacy, and the white supremacists intentionally brought weapons to instigate violence." Now, there are dozens more of these stories found in media and online. And of course, we know the most tragic act of violence was when a young man decided to use his car as a weapon. This week, we also saw that hatred was not limited to our nation and to our corner of the world. Barcelona and other cities in Spain were hit by terrorist attacks this week, with dozens dead and hundreds injured. And if we delve deeper into the news stories, the things that our eyes just pass over, we hear about domestic violence and child abuse, about wars and terrorism, about road rage and murder. And I got to tell you, I've spent a lot of time this week trying to understand how hatred is born. In the decades after World War II, the American Psychological Association spent a lot of time trying to understand whether hatred was something that we are born with or if it's something that is learned. And it seems like the scientific consensus now is that it is something we learn. And they ask some of the same questions that we ask, and maybe the ones that you've asked in your heart this week. What causes human beings to demean and destroy other human beings? What causes us to lash out and commit acts of violence? As we develop our sense of right and wrong, we pick up social cues and teachings along the way of our development. We are taught to make judgments and choices. We are taught to fear that which threatens our identity and our worth. Nelson Mandela, as he was trying to rebuild the nation of South Africa after the ravages of apartheid, once wrote, "No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin or his background or his religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, then they can be taught to love. For love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. Now, psychologists have tried to explain the science of hatred. They've explored and that more, and they've discovered that fear is the primary motivating factor of our hatred of others. Now, this is not a new concept. Mahatma Gandhi said something similar in the earlier of the 20th century, and he wrote, "The enemy is fear. We think it is hate, but it is really fear." And in the letter of 1 John, if we go back to the early Christian teachings, we hear these words, "Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not reached perfection in love. We love God because he first loved us. Those who say, 'I love God,' and hate their brothers or sisters are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. The commandment we have from him is this: those who love God must love their brothers and sisters also." Martin Luther King Jr., in his book Strength to Love, writes that the ethics of the Christian life is this: returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. Hate multiplies hate, violence multiplies violence, and toughness multiplies toughness in a descending spiral of destruction. So when Jesus says, "Love your enemies," he is setting forth a profound and ultimately inescapable admonition. Have we not come to such an impasse in the modern world that we must love our enemies or else? The chain reaction of evil, hate begetting hate, wars producing wars, must be broken, or we shall be plunged into the dark abyss of annihilation. I do not believe we are in that dark abyss of annihilation yet. Are we on the precipice? Are we on that cliff staring down into it? Maybe. I think it's fair to say that wherever your politics are, whether it's on the right or the left or somewhere in the middle, the common response to what is going on in the world right now is at a minimum disgust, and at our most extreme fearfulness. And we are fearful of many things. We're fearful that our church will be forgotten by a younger generation because they don't worship the way we do. We are fearful that our children will be worse off than we are because they don't listen to all that we have gone through. We are fearful that we won't be able to survive into retirement because we are left behind in an economy that we don't understand. We are fearful that our principles and beliefs will be challenged. And what does that mean for everything that we hold dear? Does that mean that we are rejected too if what we value is rejected? And so what are we to do in the face of this fear? Do we react with violence against those who are as scared as we? Do we retreat from the world and choose to ignore the hatred? Paul writes in today's lesson that we should not hate the Jews, God's chosen people. For as he points out to the Roman church that he is writing to, he himself is a Jewish person from the tribe of Benjamin. And if we do not hate the Jews, then we cannot hate anyone else either. He writes that just as you were once disobedient to God, but have now received mercy because of their disobedience, so they have now been disobedient in order that by the mercy shown to you, they too may now receive mercy. You see, Paul writes that in God's great plan of salvation, God will use us, flawed human beings, to save others. Unfortunately, the roots of Nazism and white supremacy can be traced back to 4th century writings of early bishops of the church who wanted to separate totally from the Jewish community. The hope that Paul expressed in his letter to the Romans was dashed by people like Augustine and John Chrysostom in the 4th century. And they were dashed by the writings of Martin Luther in the 16th century. All three of these theologians' words were used by Hitler and his followers to persecute the Jews and call them Christ killers. We've learned to hate, even in our church. But we cannot do so any longer. We cannot be ruled by division based on race or creed or religion. We have a Bible study that meets on Thursday morning, and we were talking about this text. And it was easy to say, yeah, we need to love one another. But then someone challenged me and said, but how do we do that? How do we love those that we find difficulty with? On a Tuesday, my son came home from school, and he went up to my wife, and Gabriel said to my wife, well, is it okay to hate Nazis? And my wife paused for a moment, and she said, well, as Christians, we don't hate anyone. And Gabriel said, well, why not? Why can't I hate that person? And my wife said, well, because all of us are created in the image of God, and all of us can be redeemed. And we are called to love. And you know what? Hatred is caused by fear. And people who act out of hatred, well, they're afraid that you're not going to love them. And so if you tell them that you love them, even if they don't hear it, and even if they continue to hold on to their hatred, you have done all that you can to try to bring and witness to God. I want to harken back to those stories I told you at the beginning of the sermon. We heard from a woman heading back home after synagogue with her son, and her response to the white nationalists was to say peace, and peace be with you. She was reviled, she was cursed, she was called names in front of her 13-year-old child. But she offered peace, trying as much as she could to reach out to the common shared humanity we have with others. The pastor from Charlottesville spoke about nonviolent resistance. He and many others sung hymns, took turns praying, and wore their clergy robes to kind of stand in the middle between those who were white supremacists and those who were seeking to respond to those white supremacists with violence. And finally, I recall that UVA student witnessing acts of violence committed on the white nationalists. And she and others ran to defend a man marching in the name of hate from being violently beaten. And I recall the words of Jesus to a young lawyer who asked how we are to love others and what it means to love our neighbor. Jesus responds by telling that story of the Good Samaritan and saying that everyone is our neighbor, that we cannot be the one who ignores the beaten man in the road because we are afraid of what others might think, or because we believe it is not our problem, or that we might be a target of attacks by the bandits that may be waiting for us. No, we act with mercy. We act with boldness. We stand up to our fear, and we love, not only with our words, but in our actions too. Amen.